But without further ado, James Suh, I will let you go ahead and kick it off.
Awesome. Thanks so much. This is always difficult for me as an introvert, as most of us IT folks are. Again, I'm the CIO for Bunker Labs. I've been in the role for about 6 months. I was both a Navy and a Marine Corps veteran, just could not decide. I did find it a little bit comical. Our guest is Jason Brown. He's a former Naval or Air Force officer, communications officer. And despite being an Air Force communications officer, he asked to have a Navy theme song effectively playing as his intro song. So sort of get into that. Jason is a specialist leader at Deloitte and focuses a lot of his attention on cybersecurity. So I will turn it over to Jason. If you could tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into cybersecurity.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, James, and thank you, Bunker Labs, certainly for having me here today. Good morning to everyone. As mentioned, my name is Jason Brown. I'm a specialist leader at Deloitte. I actually live in Huntsville, Alabama, and I have also been enjoying the remote work environment. I will warn you, if you see a little dog head pop up out of my lap, I apologize. That's the only way to keep him quiet at the moment. So, but happy to be here. So. I've been in cybersecurity, as James mentioned, for the past 20 years. I was in the Air Force. However, I have a tendency to use the Danger Zone song to test my surround sound speaker. So I figured, what a better way? Is there a better way to introduce the topic of cyber by talking about Danger Zone? My goal today is not to scare anybody by any means, but it is certainly to inform folks about the topic who may or may not have a background. I have been primarily supporting the Department of Defense my entire career, however, have been certainly involved in a number of different commercial entities, with commercial entities as well, and helping them with incident response and those types of things. I've been doing consulting for the past 14 years as well, and so I've gotten the chance to meet a lot of great people, certainly across the services. So, James mentioned my Air Force background. I'm certainly partial to the DoD, but also have been involved in a number of other things. I'm an avid sports fan, so the past 3 months has really been a little bit difficult with no sports on TV or being played. It's good to see it's coming back. I will say, in Alabama, there's only one sport, and that's college football, and we don't know what's going to happen there, but I am happy to be here. And again, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you're talking about Auburn, correct?
I'm not going to openly admit which side, just because people may hang up the phone as soon as I say something. So.
Got it. So cybersecurity is a really complex topic. We're hearing about it all the time, but I don't think most of us really or genuinely understand what it is. Can you take a little time to give us maybe a Reader's Digest overview of cybersecurity and why it's important?
Yeah, absolutely. So, many of you, if you're familiar with, have some military background, and I will say it has probably taken anywhere from 10 to 15 years to learn the acronyms, the lingo. It's different in every service branch. I will say cyber is no different. So if you were to ask 100 people, what's the definition of cyber, you're probably going to get 100 different answers. And so, one of the things that I like to do is really just certainly give you my perspective, but let's defer to a Wikipedia definition, if you will. I'm just going to read it for you here really quick, and then I'm going to kind of pick it apart just to give you what my thought is on cyber, where it's going, and how we kind of talk about it. And so, cybersecurity or computer security or IT security, network security, it's essentially the protection of computer systems and networks, and I'm reading this because I want to get it right, from the theft of or damage to their hardware, software, or electronic data, as well as from the disruption or misdirection of the services they provide. So that's a Wikipedia definition. I'm going to give you my definition of what I think cybersecurity is. And essentially, when we talk about computers, there is no traditional computer sense anymore. What we talk about is things that have logic-bearing components. So things that can make a decision. Whether I give a physical or logical input, I'm expecting some sort of a response. Nowadays, that's iPads, that's phones, that's cars, that's refrigerators, that's watches, that's pacemakers. There's a lot of bad guys out there that are trying to manipulate people through hacking into their pacemakers inside of their bodies. So the world has changed from having a computer on your desk, having a big tower standing next to you where we're doing things. But it's also transitioned into electric grids. It's transitioned into industrial control systems. So things that control our water, things that control energy. It also includes things like thermostats. It also includes things like weapon systems. So things, missiles, satellites, rockets. And one thing that you probably don't take out of that definition from Wikipedia is it also includes people. We've got a big brain up here, some bigger than others, but I would say that people are a huge, when it comes to cyber, and we can't lose sight of the fact that exists. I will say, how I kind of turn that definition on its head a little bit is really the identification and protection of a device or a being, and the communication mechanism that it uses to respond to any physical or logical input. That's kind of how I define cyber. I will say, for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to talk a little bit about third-party suppliers and businesses, large businesses, small businesses. And I will say, the amount of protection that you give a device or a being also varies. For example, if I've got a small business that's, say, providing paper to the Department of Defense, let's use Dunder Mifflin as an example, that's probably going to get a little less protection than, say, a small business who's providing a chipset for an exo-atmospheric kill vehicle that supports the missile defense program. And so there's a lot of things that vary. And when we talk about cyber, as I mentioned, you're going to get 100 different answers. There's also a lot of different domains that cyber includes. And so for those of you that have delved deep into the cyber world and may have gotten a certification, a certified information systems security professional would say, there's 8 different domains as it relates to cyber. Those include security and risk management, asset security, architecture and communications, identity and access management, and the list goes on. And so, James, the important aspect is there's many different facets. I would say it's difficult to define because it means something different to everyone. But I would say the important aspect is it can be a number of different things, and it's not just it's not just the computer sitting on your desk.
Yeah, for sure. Probably explains why it's so complex and difficult to sort of manage around. So the cyber threat landscape, I look back 15, 20 years ago, and it was just a much simpler time, simpler place, just a few people sort of in that space, a lot of college kids bored on the weekends, trying to hack into someone's computer, steal a few bucks. Can you talk about the overall cyber threat landscape today and how it's really evolved over the last 10 to 15 years and sort of infiltrated every aspect of our lives, it seems like?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing I'll say that has really held true over the past 15 years is that, the attackers are always going to pick the easy route. We as humans are naturally lazy. Attackers are no different. And so, when we talk about complex hacks and we talk about, 12-step processes that these nation-state type adversaries are using, while that is absolutely true, they also still are going to take the easy way in. And so one of the things that I'll reference here and mention is, I would encourage all of you who, whether you do or don't have a cyber background, Verizon produces a data breach investigation report every year, and they have for the past 13 years. This year, it recently came out over the past few months, and I would encourage all of you to take a look at that, because what they do is they break down what has occurred over the past 10 years, how trends are changing. They break it down by industry, they break it down by threats, they break it down in all kinds of different ways that's really illuminating as to what's happening over the past 12-month period. And so I would encourage you to look at that. Couple things I want to highlight, though. You can't have a conversation about cyber without talking about metrics or statistics or numbers. And so I want to highlight a couple things that not only came out of that report, but just in general. And one of those is, they look at breaches over the course of the year. And more specifically, there was 3,950 publicly available breaches that occurred that were confirmed that they investigated. And I will say that there was a number of more than that, but these are the ones that were publicly available. And so I'm going to take you through a couple of things that are big takeaways for me that I think would be big takeaways for you as well. And so one of those is that people are always going to be the biggest weakness. And a lot of times what makes cyber so complex is, we can't control people as easily as we can control technologies. And so the evidence and artifacts that resulted from the breach here, the report here include, and highlight that trend. And so 22% of all breaches include some sort of a social media type avenue. So think social engineering, think spear phishing, think phishing, those kinds of things. 17% of all breaches, which is a huge increase over the past few years, involve human error. So think, I've got an IT guy, or I have a person who's playing the IT guy or playing the cyber guy who's responsible for setting up equipment in my environment, but maybe probably shouldn't be the right person setting it up, puts it out there, misconfigures it, and now the bad guy has a way in. So we're seeing a lot of attacks as a result of human error. I'll say 8% of attacks were people with authorized access that were misusing equipment. So that trend has gone down just a little bit, but it still happens and still is important. I will say one of the interesting things, and many of you have probably heard about the insider threat and how important that is, and it has been very important. There's been some very publicly, especially in the DoD world, there's been some public media about some folks that have released classified information over the past few years. But I will say 70% of the attacks over the past year have been external to the organization. So it hasn't necessarily been insider focused. It's the external entities that are focused. And I think we'll come back to that. A couple other statistics that I think are extremely important is that 44% of breaches involve some sort of a malware. However, the important aspect of that is 80% of them started with credential reuse. They started with stolen credentials. They started with brute forcing credentials. And so I will tell you, the adversaries will always use the easy way in, as I mentioned, and it's very easy. We make the job much easier when we release our credentials and don't have complex passwords. And I'm sure that's been beat into people's heads over and over again, but it's extremely important. I will say 72% of the breaches involve large businesses, 28% involve small businesses. The interesting trend, which I'll get to in a minute, is the attackers focused on much different things from 2010 to 13 to what they're focusing on now. And what they're focusing on now in both small businesses and large businesses is the social media aspect, the credential reuse. And so many of the breaches over the past year were very financially motivated. And so almost to the tune of 86%, which we talked a little bit about ransomware. I think we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But one more final statistic that I think is important is 43% of all the breaches were due to web application attacks. So think, again, that IT administrator, that cyber administrator, or that resource that a small business may have that puts out a web application, whether that's in the cloud or whether that's hosted. The bad guys are nailing these publicly facing assets that aren't configured correctly. They may not have two-factor authentication. And that's a big change from the previous years where physical intrusion and things like spyware were very important. I will say, as we enter the COVID environment and everybody is working remotely, there's a large push by the attackers to manipulate VPN software. So think Zoom, Teams, all of these collaboration tools that we now communicate with. The bad guys are trying to access them. And there's been reports previously, certainly within the DoD, that there were bad guys sitting in on Zoom conversations that weren't adequately password protected and where security was implemented appropriately. And so as we change the workforce over the next I think it's probably a permanent change in the future. There's going to be more remote work, not just telework. It's going to be permanent, and so we have to consider, things like how we communicate using VPN technologies and those types of things. Because I'll add, we're all accessing the internet from our home networks, right? And so how we set up our home router, our home environment is going to become extremely important. Because the adversary has automated tools to get in and understand where the weak points are. And so I just went on and said a lot there, James, but hopefully that kind of sets the landscape a little bit as to where the adversary is tracking.
Yeah, for sure. You said 86% of the attacks were financially motivated, so it seems like the solution is to not make any money in the business. So we have a few audience questions that came up. I think some of these are really interesting points. What do you think about the current advancements in artificial intelligence, and how do you think that's going to shape the future?
Yeah, so great question. I will say it's going to shape the future both in a good way and in a bad way, because not only do we have the capability, but so do the adversaries. And so one of the trends that we're seeing is that, the adversaries, and just to give you a little bit more background on me, I'm very threat focused. If we can't think like an adversary, then we can't adequately defend our environments. And so I tend to try and flip things on its side a little bit. And so, to answer that question, I think AI and I think, big data and machine learning and a lot of these types of things are certainly more than just buzzwords, but I will say the efficiencies that are going to be gained by automating a number of the things that typically takes a human hours to do is going to make the job of the adversary easier, I should say, but it's also going to make our job a little bit easier. And so, I don't think we're to the point when we talk about AI where we can say robots are going to take over the world without any human interaction, because we are still going to require humans in the loop, if you will, to be able to perform the right amount of due diligence when it comes to a lot of the behaviors that are out there, a lot of the attacks that are occurring. But we can use AI and automate and neural networks, if you will, to start to learn some of these things over the course of the time and improve our response efficiencies. But we just have to remember that it's going to also help the adversaries.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So there's a question around hiring and staff. So let me kind of interpret this question a little bit. I've worked in a lot of organizations when I've stepped in where it's just easier to give everyone access to pretty much anything, not put a lot of locks on files. Everyone has admin access just for simplicity. Can you talk about how potentially big of a risk that can be for an organization?
Yes, I have been part of those organizations. That is a huge risk. I will tell you that, the first set of individuals that adversaries target are people with privileged access. And there's a reason for that. And that is because they can do anything that they want to do based off of having root privileges or administrative privileges. The concept of least privilege is not a dying concept, and it is an important concept. For your standard users, they should only be able to do standard user things. I'm not going to name any organizations here by any means, but it is much easier to give users admin access so that you don't constantly have to respond to troubleshooting calls when an application doesn't work. I will say that is a poor excuse nowadays. And I will tell you, I tell my kids the same thing. Dad, I can't play Fortnite because I don't have admin privileges to install it on on PlayStation Sony. Sorry, kids. I'm gonna show you why this is important. And so, James, I can't stress the importance of making sure you segment your user populace so that they only have the permissions that they need to do their job. That's difficult in very large organizations sometimes, especially in very heavy software development organizations or engineering heavy organizations. And there's going to have to be some flexibility. the importance of the development versus a test versus a production environment is there's a reason why we have all of those environments. And so it is a huge risk, and it makes the job of an adversary extremely easy, especially to enumerate a network once they're inside. If everybody has access, then it doesn't make it very hard.
Yeah, no, that's true. So let me kind of jump to an interesting topic. I'm an avid runner. I don't think I run counts unless I've sort of tracked it on my Garmin device and uploaded it to Strava. There was a 7-day period when Garmin was just taken down hard offline, and I was stressed to the limits because I couldn't post my run on social media. Can you talk about what happened there, that incident, and sort of the issues that led up to that, and maybe some of the resolution on the back end?
Sure. So I am definitely familiar with the attack. I will say in this particular case, rest assured, the intent of the attack was not data exfiltration. It was not to steal your data. It was very financially motivated. And so this was a case of, and I believe it happened in July of this year. It was a ransomware attack. And essentially, the malware used, it's called Wasted Locker, actually, which is interesting in itself. But there's affiliations to Russian malware groups, and who are starting to target more Fortune 500 companies for the financial gain. And so, over the past 10 years, the trend in ransomware is increasing quite a bit. I will say, and I'll talk about what ransomware is here in just a second, but 5 or 6 years ago, these hackers, kind of individual hackers, were asking for, hey, pay me $25,000, pay me $50,000, and I'll decrypt your files for you. So ransomware is essentially bad guys getting in, encrypting your file systems and all of the services that use that file system so that none of the customer base can use it or access it. And they keep the private key, and they essentially say, hey, I'll release your files as long as you pay me X amount of dollars. And so again, traditionally that dollar amount was in the, anywhere from $15,000 to $50,000. Now we're talking millions of dollars, upwards of $10 million. So in this particular case, again, I don't have the insider or intricate details of Garmin. I would assume that they are still maybe recovering, but you're right. They were down for a week. There's reports that they were requesting $10 million for this ransom notice. And I can't confirm that they actually paid them or not. I don't know. There's reports that they may have paid them in order to get their services back up. But it was a pretty big hit. And it was a hit to their user community. It was a hit to their brand. Pilots who use Fly Garmin, as an example, could not get their aviation updates into their database. And of course, FAA requires you to have that in order for you to be able to fly. Users, James, you were one of them, weren't able to access their information and access the Garmin databases. And so it's a real problem. But I would say, in this particular case, this particular Russian group wasn't the only, Garmin wasn't their only target. And so there were indications that existed previously that could have been put in place to at least understand what's happening. Now, I will say a lot of these ransomware cases are very specific to an organization, but there are still some similarities that can occur. And so, for example, in this particular case, with this Wasted Locker malware, files that were put on people's computers started with wasted. And of course, they were relevant to the particular organization. But when an IT or a cyber person or an individual starts seeing some of those file names show up, that should be a red flag, right? And so, but the fact of the matter is, not everybody's aware and has the knowledge to look for those kinds of things. And so, a couple of things that came out of that, James, other than some potential users jumping to Apple rather than using their Garmin's anymore, are what's important. What are the things that we need to do to be able to recover from something like that? And I would say, things like offline backups, especially in large organizations, are extremely important. I would say online backups are also equally important. However, a lot of these bad guys and the ransomware attacks that they use also attack the online storage infrastructures. And so that's why I say offline backups are extremely important. Extremely important is external reconnaissance. If you don't have anybody on your staff or on your team that understands how they operate, the things that they're doing, and kind of following that industry, if you will, then you may miss out and you may get hit and become reactive rather than proactive.
That makes sense. So can you dig a little bit more and talk about sort of our current perspective on cyber risk identification and what really needs to change for companies to effectively combat the threat? I think it seems like a lot of us are taking a very reactive approach. Well, it's probably not going to happen, but if it happens, we'll kind of recover from it very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. So, traditionally over the past 15 years, organizations, whether small or large, have taken what I'd say is an inside-out approach. And what I mean by that is, hey, let me focus on all of the things that are inside my whether it be physical walls or logical walls, if you will, and I want to make sure that those are as secure as possible. I'm going to buy technologies that I'm told to buy, and I just got to make sure that I meet compliance requirements. So I check the box to make sure I have the things in place that either I'm told to put in place or I think is appropriate based off of what industry is telling me. And I'd say that's great. We need to continue to do that, but that's only 50% of the problem. The other 50% of the problem is, well, what do I look like from an external perspective? What do I look like from an adversary's perspective? How does the adversary see me? I may be putting protections in place that the adversary doesn't care about. And so why would I waste dollars and resources to monitor assets that don't mean anything from a threat perspective? And so I would say we have to change our perspective a little bit, James, and make sure that we understand, well, what does my attack surface actually look like as it relates to my organization, as it relates to my people, as it relates to my systems. And so we've got to be able to understand that perspective in order for us to be successful, not only from a defensive side of the house, but also, are we deploying, are the things that we're deploying in our environments, are they effective or are they not effective? And the threat's going to tell you that pretty quickly. And if we don't have eyes on, if you will, then it's hard to discern whether or not we're doing a good job or not. Because I can tell you that compliance, although is a good baseline, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're secure.
That's great. Thanks for the info. So we talked, I think, in previous conversations around sort of mitigating risk from cyber threats through sort of 3 different channels: personal identification and exposure, systems, networks, and technologies, and organizational affiliations and fourth-party services. Can you talk about these groups and maybe some examples to make it a bit more real world for us? Yeah,
absolutely. So, there's probably more than those, 3 or 4 components, but I think those capture, from a categorization perspective, the most important things that the adversaries are prioritizing. And so, let's talk about personnel first of all. It's no secret that people like social media, Facebook, Twitter. More people like Twitter than others, but it is an avenue that people use to connect. Whether you're in the commercial space, whether you're forward deployed as part of a military battalion or team, it's used. Adversaries know that, and so what they try to do is really understand who is the most important in that particular environment that will get to my target, that I can use to get to my target. And so again, we've already talked about this a little bit. They're looking for folks who disclose that they have elevated privileges. Hey, I work at Deloitte and I have access to classified networks and I have access to, I'm the administrator for all of our cybersecurity and our IT networks, and I love what I do, and here's the technologies that I use. Most of that information is in resumes, it's in things like job postings, and so adversaries are using those types of sources, and to be honest with you, running AI-based algorithms against them to target and find individuals that they can go attack very quickly. So that's an example from a personnel perspective. We as people tell people a lot of things. Many of it is unnecessary. And so, that's a personnel aspect. I would say from a systems and technologies perspective, I highlighted it once already, but I'm going to do it again because it's extremely important. Publicly facing applications that can be scanned through commercial tools that adversaries buy. They can be scanned through free tools that are available to anyone, allow us to see what is communicating on the internet. Many organizations have put out publicly facing web applications. It may be their corporate website. That's not necessarily what I'm talking about in this particular case. I'll get to that in a second. But I'm talking about things like their VPN portal that doesn't use two-factor authentication, their internal financial systems that they put out that they don't realize is externally facing, their firewalls or their intrusion device management consoles that they don't realize they messed up the network configuration and they're available to the adversaries. Adversaries can quickly see those devices and they can see what kind of authentication that they're using, and in combination with what people disclose that can be found in publicly available data dumps, it's really easy to try and reuse credentials to try and access those things. And so adversaries are using analytics, they're using AI, they're using machine learning to be able to piece these things together. And so that's a critical thing that we need to be aware of. I mentioned resumes and job postings. Another interesting thing is specifically in the DoD space, the DoD announces what contractors win what contracts. Hey, if I need to go find out who's doing hypersonic weapon system development as part of the DoD, let me go search a public-facing GovWin solicitation to see what contractors won that work. All right, now I'm going to go target those guys. And so, we make it relatively easy. I understand some things have to occur, but these are the kinds of things that are ongoing that make the adversary's job a little bit easier. Let me jump finally to the organizational affiliation and third parties. So, third-party risk, back to the original question, James, is trending upward. Over certainly the past 3 years, definitely the past couple years. And what I mean by that is adversaries are no longer going direct to the source, direct to the target, whether it's commercial, whether it's public sector, so local government, state government, federal government. They are going to go to the furthest away entity from their direct target because A, that entity is probably not aware they need to be doing anything from a cyber perspective. But they also probably aren't aware that they have a direct tie into a national weapon system program, as an example. I'll give you a couple more statistics. We get a lot of questions sometimes about, well, I don't even know who my suppliers are beyond my prime contractor, as an example. Maybe they know who the next tier contractor is, but did you realize that 60% of your contract base is overseas? And they're producing chipsets and firmware and these types of things. What does the logistics train look like from where it's being manufactured to when it actually gets put into a particular system? Up until recently, we weren't doing the right amount of due diligence to track that and understand that, specifically from a cyber perspective. And so, that's why I say that's another great example of why organizational affiliation, why third-party relationships are being analyzed. And I'm not talking just about, the chipset provider to a major weapon system. I'm talking about, the folks that provide janitorial services or trash services to any type of entity. We have tools like Google Earth that allow us to take pictures of facilities. Hey, if I see a dumpster over there with a waste management sticker on it, or pick your favorite vendor there, I'm going to target those guys and I'm going to go put a t-shirt on that says waste management and I'm going to try and get into the facility. And so, those are examples of what the adversary is doing and how the attack surface and threat landscape is continuing to change, and how to one of the folks' questions, how the adversary is using the tools that we are starting to use as well to their advantage.
That's great. So there's an overwhelming amount of information and things to learn. And I think to sort of address as an organization, I think to address the threats. So that kind of brings us to the cybersecurity maturity model certifications. Can you talk us through that, your perspective on its potential value and how organizations of all sizes could potentially leverage that to strengthen their stance or their position in cybersecurity?
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is a great tie-in to my previous point. The adversaries are beginning to, not beginning to, but they're continuing to increase their focus on third-party suppliers. So within the Department of Defense, they've introduced what they call this cybersecurity maturity model certification. If any of you are software developers or have some insight into software development, it follows the CMMI kind of certification process. And essentially what it is if you as an organization, whether you're large or small or medium-sized, are going to do business with the Department of Defense, we want to make sure you meet a certain level of cyber posture just so that we're doing our due diligence as it relates to cyber. And so what is happening is that they've formed essentially 5 levels of certification. If you recall in the beginning of this conversation, I mentioned Dunder Mifflin and the paper company versus the small business that's building chipsets, for a missile defense system. Well, the small business that's building chipsets for the missile defense system is probably going to have a higher level certification, meaning they need to be able to implement more controls and have a better cyber posture than, say, the paper company, who is just going to need to provide and be cognizant of their cyber hygiene and do some basic level things. And so, the push is we want to help you get better as a Department of Defense. And if you want to do business with us, please jump on board, and we're going to try we're going to require you to meet certification requirements so that we can ensure that we're doing the right things as it relates to cyber posture. And so that's really the emphasis. I will say it's a rollout period. I want to say the expectation over the next 5 years is essentially to have, so by FY25, is to have approximately 128,000 organizations be CMMC certified. That requires a lot of things to happen. And so, DoD, specifically the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, is driving this. And really it's the basic principle is to protect all of the controlled unclassified information that exists out in these organizations, again, whether small or large. And so it's really not to replace existing regulations. Many of you may be familiar with DFARS requirements and controls that have to be met. It's not meant to replace that. It's meant to complement that and really, put some accountability to what we're saying. And so we oftentimes hear the what, we oftentimes don't get the how. And so this is supposed to help with some of that how. How do we do this? So hopefully that helps.
No, that's incredibly helpful. That sounds like a rather complex journey to get that certification, but maybe as sort of a parting question, if we only did one thing, both as a company or as an individual today in the very near term to mitigate cyber risk, what would you recommend? What would that be and why?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I often get this question and folks are expecting me to respond with, you need to go buy technology X. You need to go buy technology Y. And that's not my answer. My answer is if there's one thing that you can do, it would be to change your perception. We can't continue to assume that we're safe. We have to assume that we have been attacked, hacked, penetrated, pick your favorite word. The most important thing is, who do we have available as part of our resource pool within our organization that can respond and understand how to get better? And so changing the perception is extremely important. And that requires a few things, James. So I'm not being fair and giving you a one-word answer here, but that requires a few things. One is training and education is extremely important. There's no doubt about it. A small business organization, it doesn't make sense to go spend hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on cyber tools or infrastructure that you may not need, depending on what service you provide. but I would strongly encourage you to hire someone that has a knowledge of threat and really can understand, that, well, what's important to us as an organization, and what does the threat think of us as an organization based off of what we do. That bringing that together is extremely important. And then educating your people. As I mentioned, the trends are increasing, over the past 15 years to things like phishing and credential harvesting and stolen credentials. And the fact of the matter is people are just going to continue to be lazy. And so I strongly encourage, leadership within organizations to actually exercise your folks. Hey, experiment with a phishing campaign and let's see how many of your people actually respond and how many don't. And use it as an educational opportunity so that you're not the one like Garmin who has a ransomware attack because one of your folks clicked on a phishing link, as an example. Things can be prevented, certainly, but we can't prevent everything, and you won't prevent everything, especially if you have the mentality that you can. And so that's how I would answer that, James.
I appreciate that. Incredibly valuable. Well, thanks for the time, Jason. I forgot to compliment you in the beginning about your slick haircut. Love it. Yeah, no, I understand the insights. There's a lot for us, even as an organization within Bunker Labs, to work on, definitely based on your perspectives and thoughts on here. And we're interested in digging into that a little bit more. But yeah, Liz, I think we're done. This was fantastic, and really appreciate you taking the time, Jason, and all the attendees for listening in.
Yeah, sorry, Liz. I would just say if you do have questions that either I didn't answer or we weren't able to get to, Liz, I think you're, certainly shoot emails, because this is a community effort. This is not a Deloitte effort. This isn't a Bunker Labs effort. This is a community effort, and it takes industry, it takes government, it takes individuals, and I'm part of that community, and we won't win unless we collaborate. And trust me, I like to win. Nick Saban has a few lines there that I won't give, because again, people hang up quickly. But I'm happy to answer any questions offline. So Liz, over to you. Thank you for the opportunity.